This is Dylan FM, the podcast that goes deep into the work and world of Bob Dylan. If you love Dylan, you're in the right place. With your host, Craig Danieloff.
If you want to better understand and appreciate Bob Dylan, you could do no better than to read or listen to Michael Gray. He's the guy who took Dylan seriously first, writing the first real book about him, which some have called the step that began the journey to the Nobel Prize. What Michael does with incredible skill and precision is to look at the work Bob Dylan does and observe things about it, its relation to other works of art or cultural events, the techniques it employs, the places where it is especially creative or successful or unique. And in a trait I very much admire, he also notes when he thinks Dylan misses the mark, either partially or in his mind completely. Today we're talking to Michael about Bob Dylan and folk music, the topic at the center of A Complete Unknown, and coincidentally the first chapter in his book, Song and Dance Man, Volume 1. We published an excerpt from this chapter on our Substack today, and here we explore in vastly more detail than the movie was able to do what Dylan did during his time singing folk and what he learned and took far beyond that time. In future episodes, we'll talk about subsequent chapters from Michael's book and how Dylan similarly interacted with and transacted with rock and roll, literature, language, and the blues. There are additional excerpts from the book throughout this discussion, and you'll hear those read by Michael Hacker. We'll start with one of those excerpts and then listen to my conversation with Michael Gray on Bob Dylan and folk music.
When Dylan first went east and arrived in New York at the start of the 60s, the repertoire and styles of delivery he brought with him provided a culture shock, not only to Sinatra-tuned audiences, but also to the patrons of the many small folk clubs, then in bloom around Greenwich Village. As he recalls the latter's reaction, it ran as follows: "You sound like a hillbilly. We want folk singers here." The point, made here with a characteristic lightness of irony, is of course that Dylan was a folk singer, and to learn how his early work was received is to understand the various misconceptions that obtained in New York at that time, and which, from New York, spread, though not back into the Appalachians, via college circuits and out across the Atlantic. To sound like a folk singer, you were supposed to be smoothly ingenuous, angry, and above all, sensitive.
And you go on to talk about Peter, Paul, and Mary and some of the other acts that Dylan was put up next to or stood next to when he arrived in the village. Let's start there with your thoughts and that characterization of what was unique about Bob, kind of the second he stepped into Greenwich Village.
Okay, well, first of all, I think that very first that introduction to the chapter is a little on the arrogant side, because there was more variety in the people in Greenwich Village than that account gives credit for. There were people who were very real as well. There were people like Dave Van Ronk, the mayor of MacDougall Street, and very famously, Dylan stole his arrangement of House of the Rising Sun straight from Van Ronk. Just before Van Ronk was going to record it, Dylan had heard Van Ronk sing it live, and he rushed into the CBA, the Columbia Record Studio, and did it first, and there it was. So there was more variety in the people there, but it's true what Dylan says that some people were very rigid about what genre of folk music they were prepared to be a performer of. That's one thing, people who sang Northern Forest work songs wouldn't sing sea shanties, and people who sang Southern Mountain songs wouldn't sing Irish ballads. So there was that. That was one kind of rigidity. There was a lot of rigidity. And the other thing was that that a lot of these people didn't think it was their job to write songs. In fact, they thought it was not at all the done thing, you know. What they thought was that their job was to try to get back to the most immaculate, virginal version of a traditional folk song that they could possibly unearth. And that was, you know, the older it was, the more authentic they were. So writing songs was a no-no for many of these people. So that was another way in which Dylan was distinctive. He had this devotion to Guthrie, and he had honed his voice partly on Guthrie's. And so he had a rougher voice than all the Peter, Paul, and Marys, and also a more rougher kind of stage presence and approach than a lot of the people who were trying to be very purist. But also, you know, that was a kind of rock and roll attitude that he brought to this. You know, he'd had an electric guitar and been devoted to Little Richard and the others before he took up with folk music. I mean, you know, he realized that folk music had in some ways much more to offer than 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock rock, or, you know, I love you, please be true. But nevertheless, he came to folk music from teenage rock and roll fandom. And many of those people who were there in Greenwich Village with a small name for themselves and an acoustic guitar had not come out of that genre. Or if they had, they'd certainly pretended they hadn't.
It's interesting how the characteristics we think of as Dylan-esque, you know, decades later, were kind of there in terms of the seemingly not caring what people thought and being willing to go against the grain and the self-confidence, you know, to do it against what he had to hear, the various criticisms we all hear about, I mean, him at the time, not even him, the superstar, just him, the kind of little weirdo. And yet he forged, you know, straight ahead, you know, reflecting on his own learnings and changing when he wanted to, but not, you know, not giving a damn, as he would later say.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that, you know, part of what he was doing when he arrived in Greenwich Village was sitting at the feet of some of these old blues singers. You know, he wasn't just looking at who was the biggest name or who was the guy who got the most young women in the folk club audience. He was sitting at the feet of John Lee Hooker and blind Gary Davis and so on.
You think that was unique, meaning that he sought them out and spent that time? That's an observation I hadn't heard before.
I think, you know, when Sam Charters published his book Country Blues in 1959, what he was saying was, everyone knows about the electric blues from Chicago after the war, the Muddy Waters stuff, but there's this whole ocean of pre-war blues from the 20s and 30s, and the thing about these marvelous old records, Charters was saying, is that these people are not from Mars, you know. They were Americans, and some of them may still be among us. And his book inspired a whole bunch of young, white folk enthusiasts, blues enthusiasts, to go down to the South, to the deep South, and try to find, still alive, these old guys. And there were many successes. And so, no, Dylan wasn't the only one interested in these people, but he was seriously interested in watching their hands on the guitar when they were performing in folk clubs, the ones that had been rediscovered. Many of them, many of them had given up being musicians. They'd pawned their guitar in the Depression and gone back to being a janitor. They certainly were surprised to find that there was this young white enthusiasm for their very early work, and very surprised, pleasantly surprised in many cases, to find that they could make some money on a folk club stage.
We're going to go forward just a page to your talk about the Dylan album, the first album that you mentioned in terms of Columbia Studios. And you say this.
Yet what comes through from the album as a whole is a remarkable skill and more than a hint of a highly distinctive vision. In the context of what was happening at the time, American folk culture all but obliterated and a stagnating folk cult established as if in its place. Dylan's first album can hardly be faulted. It is a brilliant debut, a performer's tour de force, and served as a fine corrective for Greenwich Village. It was the opposite of a feat.
Oh yeah, well, it certainly can. You can accuse it of being derivative, but you can't accuse it of being a feat. It's got a lot of that raw quality. It's a lot of it is him trying to sound as old as possible, even though he's only 20 when he's recording it. And I think I'm partially wrong here as well, because I think that this is what I'm saying in that quote is doing Dave Van Ronk a disservice, because he was also a fine corrective to the kind of Peter, Paul and Mary stuff, And there's all the world. There's more difference between Puff the Magic Dragon and any Dave Van Ronk album than there is between any Dave Van Ronk album and Bob's first album. But nevertheless, if you think about what Albert Grossman, Dylan's manager, was also managing, he was managing Peter, Paul and Mary, and I'm sure they were very nice people, but they were not real in the same way that Bob was, and they were not mining the work of old bluesmen in the way that Van Ronk and Dylan, and no doubt others who never became famous at all, were doing.
Does it surprise you that album didn't, the reaction that it got? I mean, there's two things: looking back at what happened at the time, and then maybe talk more about looking back now and with the benefit of those 60 years and seeing how much of what we now know to be Dylan was really there.
It doesn't surprise me that it wasn't a successful album at the time. It doesn't surprise me at all, because who was this guy, There's this album with this very chubby-faced little urchin on the cover with his Huck Finn cap and his chubby cheeks. And inside there's all this "see that my grave is kept clean" stuff. So, there's a disjunction there that and what was there to make it a successful album? How many people were looking for that kind of thing? Whereas obviously when we come to the second album, when we come to Freewheeling, which is full of these remarkable songs that he was writing so fast and so prolifically, clearly that's on a whole different level, and still is. I like the first album, but it's never going to be one of anybody's top 10 best Bob Dylan albums.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, given the sequence of events of how Bob is, universally revered as a songwriter, and yet those who really love him think about the singing and the communication abilities and the projection more. That on that first album, there's I guess 2 originals, if I'm remembering correctly, and yet even after 60 years, the fact that it holds up, I want to say at all, but that it's I've got you get a new pressing, it's beautiful to listen to, that it really is, it may not be the top of Bob Dylan album, which would be a hard accomplishment, but as you say, it's very enjoyable, and there's just a lot there. It's
and the 2 songs that are there, Talking New York and Song to Woody. I mean, Talking New York sums up what he was claiming was his difference beautifully in that very simple, "You sound like a hillbilly, we want folk singers here." I mean, that's a marvelously economical, biting summary of him trying to big up his own uniqueness and the way that he was misunderstood and so on. And then Song to Woody. Well, it's just the most mature, considered work, and it's delivered with that considered maturity. There's how many people at that age wanting to write a song saying, "Hey, you're my idol, and I'm unworthy to follow in your footsteps." Who else would write at that age a song so beautifully modulated and poised, and yet so obviously sincere? It's a great song.
Clearly, to say he'd been hitting some hard traveling too is not the last thing Dylan would like to be able to do. It is with those final lines, which get their special strength not just from the understatement, but from the carefully clipped reluctance of the cadence, that we get a fresh focus on the whole theme of the song. At the same time, we still hear the echoes of all those delicate rushes of confidentiality which, throughout the lyric, establish its tone. Other aspects of the song also contribute to its appeal. There is the frank, if implicit, statement of what is, on Dylan's part, a plea for an innocent dropout and the concern to find a new allegiance to the hard travelin' ethos. Again, there is a delicacy in handling this. A balance struck in perceiving both the harsh reality and the romantic flavor of this ethos. The song not only reflects Guthrie faithfully, but assesses his real but disappearing America from Dylan's, the young man's, perspective. We are offered a highly intelligent understanding of the subject.
So I want Michael to talk about 2 things. That, the quote specifically in Dylan's performance of the end of that song, but also I think this is a really great paragraph to talk about what you did in Song and Dance Man, of, as you said, looking at Dylan as someone worthy, of serious analysis and criticism, because that paragraph, unlocking what's inside a verse or 2 of Dylan, is the kind of thing that maybe no one had read in 1972.
Thank you. I think that's true. I mean, I'm talking there about, for example, about the wistful way that he talks about the people who have done the hard traveling. Here's to Cisco and Sonny and Leadbelly too, and all the good people who traveled with you. On the one hand, he knows perfectly well that it's no longer the 1930s. And he says this elsewhere, doesn't he, in one of the early poems on the back of one of the comparatively early albums. He talks about, who needs me today to be fighting this stuff. So on the one hand, he's aware that it's not the same era as this traveling that he's talking about. But on the other hand, he's also admitting that there's something very romantic about it, that there's something very, if you like, very unrealistically romantic about it. He manages to suggest that he knows that really it would be very hard living that way, you know. And I'm sure that he has in mind Woody Guthrie's autobiography, Bound for Glory, here, which is full of tales of traveling on freight trains and hopping rides and you know, having to run away from guys with big clubs in their hands, trying to beat off the bums and the hobos, you know, and gathering round with people who are, you know, coughing their lungs up whilst trying to find another fag end somewhere, cigarette end somewhere on the ground near the campfire that they're hoping will keep them warm. You know, it's not all great living the Woody Guthrie life, and Dylan is managing to say that very beautifully, while still, you know, he's partly. We couldn't have known this at the time, but we know now that, you know, he was this middle-class kid from whose father owned a sort of hardware store. He was a middle-class kid with a very comfortable home in Hibbing, Minnesota. There was no way that he needed to go hard traveling, but all the romance of it, he yearns for it. At the same time, he's so mature that he can confess that it's not going to be happening. And at the very end, the very last thing that I'd want to do is to say I'd been hitting some hard traveling too. That's a double-edged line, because he's made it clear by then that one of the things he'd really like to do would be to say he'd done some hard traveling too. And yet, along with it goes his, you know, kind of humble recognition that they did it and he hasn't had to.
How much of the songwriting genius, the songwriting accomplishment that has come from him is evidence there? Meaning, you know, that album and that song, maybe not in real time to people, but now, you know, these passages you're talking about are as good as any, you know, Dylan passages. I mean, you can argue nuance, yes, but they're worlds apart from most songwriters. Yes. in all the stuff you're unpacking. Yes. It's kind of amazing and almost a nice little, you know, foreshadowing that, you know, two songs, but this song particularly, this is the song on the album that he wrote that everybody reacts to, that even in the seed, we see it all, you know, it's all there.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are some of the early protest songs that don't show much evidence of that unique skill or maturity at all. Paths of Victory, for example, or I mean, there's not that much skill in The Times They Are Changing, seems to me, either. But Paths of Victory and Emmett Till and The Ballad of Donald White, there's none of it there. There's none of the mature uniqueness that is imprinted all through Song to Woody. And there again, the other thing in terms of performance is that some of the songs on the first album, you know, I criticize them because he's trying to sound terribly old. In other words, he's trying to claim all that experience, and he's a 20-year-old kid, you know. But on the other hand, there are other songs where he makes that "I'm a very old man" singing stance absolutely convincing. One of the outtakes from Freewheeling, Moonshiner. It's a completely immaculate performance on every level, from start to finish. You know, and he has that, I've called it that calm center of self. There's no rushing, there's no emphasizing, there's nothing declamatory about it, you know, and a sort of hysterical declamatoriness is what so much pop music has comprised for at least the last 30 years. And here is this very young man with none of it. Moonshiner is a totally immaculate performance, and just astonishing that it should have been left off the album. But there we are. Yeah, I mean, none of us can explain how he could arrive with such creative maturity so early, so very early on. But the evidence is there in Song to Woody alone.
So you mentioned protest songs, which is perfect, because what the book does in the bulk of the first bunch of chapters is talk about Dylan against or relative to folk tradition, literature, blues, and a bunch of other categories, literature itself. So here's a little bit of what you say about his protest songs. This echoes something of what you just said.
In fact, of course, the protest songs are rarely of outstanding quality. Dylan's performances of them can do little more than partly compensate, as it were, for the lack of anything in them but messages. It is not just the cliches that mar these songs, but, along with their obviousness, the assumption that cliché is necessary for emphasis, the assumption that the listener must be spoon-fed. Dylan, the writer, is giving us rhetoric, not art. In contrast, where societal comment is present in his later work, as for instance in Desolation Row, Dylan's critique is always offered in a form dictated by a most formidable art and not by an anxiety based on lack of trust in the listener.
Trusting the listener is something which is very important in Dylan's work. It seemed to me the first album that I encountered myself as a young man, as a student, was the fourth album, Another Side Of, the last solo album until the 1990s. And on that album, it took me a while to get used to his voice. But when I did get used to it, and realized what a superbly intelligent, nuanced instrument it was. One of the very striking things was how completely he trusted that he was getting his point across, however subtly he might have been saying it. And he abolishes the gulf between the grand performer and the oiks in the audience. He just speaks so directly to you, and so trusting the audience like that is he does it more than any other performer I can I can think of. I mean, although I think possibly, in more recent times, it's one of the things that he has changed in our consciousness is what's possible with popular music. It's possible to trust the audience instead of them just being told how to receive stuff. And the trouble with some of those protest songs is that he over-explains them, i.e., he doesn't trust the audience. I mean, another one that I really wince at is the one about John Brown went off to war. He gives John Brown's mother a really hard time, and it doesn't. John Brown never becomes a real individual. He's just a cipher. He's just, this is my today's protest against patriotism and the unthinkingness of people sending their children off to war. Well, it's a huge subject and it's a small song.
So talk for a minute about the method or device, the choice to look at Dylan's work in this initial set of chapters comparatively to folk literature, blues, rock, and so forth.
It seemed to me that when I was first listening to him, what astonished me was partly the length of some of the songs, because as I say, the fourth album was the first one I listened to, and so there we have Chimes of Freedom and My Back Pages, for example, and these are lengthy songs. I came to this from rock music myself. I came to it from rock and roll, and hit singles were 2.5, 3 minutes, and Bob was singing longer things than that. But also, every time he brought out a new album, he sounded completely different, and no one else did that. Everyone else had a voice, and they used it the same. Maybe when they got older and wearier, it declined a bit, like Sinatra. But Elvis Presley started sounding more like Bing Crosby. But Bob sounded younger, of course, as he progressed through the 1960s, at least until John Wesley Harding, anyway. And but what was striking too was that he was drawing upon all these different traditions. He presents himself first as a folk singer, as far as his career goes. So I had to look at how he fitted in with, not only Greenwich Village, but the actual folk tradition, as it were. And so I look at various strands of that kind of stuff, cowboy music and so on. But obviously, he very soon starts doing something radical with rock music, with rock and roll. He gives it words that matter, among other things. And so obviously there had to be a chapter about how he relates to rock music, how he comes out of a tradition of rock and roll and does something extraordinary with it. He makes it matter. I think it's Ricks, isn't it? Christopher Ricks, who says that he combines the force of poetry with the power of rock and roll. I think the force of poetry is Ricks's phrase anyway. And then quite clearly, he keeps. I was studying English literature, so I knew that there were relationships here. That this was a very literate person who was writing these songs. And I was being trained to pay close attention to the text, often of a Victorian novel, the greatest novel in the English language, Middlemarch by George Eliot. And, it was clear to me that Dylan's work was capable of bearing the weight of that kind of close to the text scrutiny. He wasn't just grabbing words here and there. He was a real artist, a literary artist. And yet, I think I say right at the very beginning, very, very close to the very beginning anyway, that his words are not poems on the page. The words are parts of songs. And the music dictates things about the way the words are organized that would be different if they were words on the page. And so, of course, does what Dylan does with his voice. So anyway, folk, rock, literature, he's right there doing something interesting and radical with all of these different traditions. And that's what the first volume of this 50th anniversary series is about. Not least the incredible way that he used pre-war blues.